Okay. And you know, Joanne, let's just take that moment where we recognize that here we are in a field that has developed from an industry that's been going on for over 20 years, and that we have clinical research and educational research on games. We have our top universities, research universities, that are looking into game research. We have clinical researchers that are looking at its impact in the clinical space, and yet we see that it's slow moving as, if you will, a mandate or even a way to create um, a mass movement in change in education. And so today I'm going to speak specifically about a course that I developed at Art Center starting in 1996. It's gone through many iterations. It's called Neurons Sparking. And it's actually only in the last 3 years that game design became an important way to boost the actual learning that was going on for students. And so let me address that. And the school at which I teach is Art Center College of Design. I'm an adjunct associate professor. And in addition, the content is coming from an institute that I developed. It's a knowledge transfer institute for neuroscience. That's George Greenstein Institute, as well as the work that I'm doing now with Rotolab as the Chief Research and Incubation Officer, using games and game curriculum to advance design education. And so let me share with you, if I can, the idea around this talk and this particular approach, to recognize that my approach comes from a particular context, which is to say that these are design students. They're not neuroscience students. It's higher education. They're undergrads. And what we're really talking about is, I think, a method that will develop like games, which is that it will come from many paths. But the idea here is that we want to use games to increase engagement and increase learning. And so we could say that with these 5 statements made on this slide, what makes an effective game for learning, Phillips and Popovic, uh, coming from the Gates Foundation research, looked at effective gaming. And this particular comment comes from an MIT initiative to think about making effective games. Some of you may have already seen this, which is to recognize that if we're going to develop games, let's make sure that we're using learning science principles and that we're not just using game design principles. And that itself is its own interesting territory to discuss if we want. The second is, how do we build into the development of games some way in which gamers can assess the effectiveness of learning? Or even if we're teaching kids to develop games, how can the students themselves think about building in some form of data analytic catcher? Third, we're really looking at the whole world of thinking about engagement and knowledge transfer, and to create games that are both engaging and have learning, right? So it's a both and situation. And next, we want to make sure that the games are optimized for many different kinds of audiences. And in fact, Joanne mentioned Jane McGonigal and addressing that kids only want to play Minecraft. I think Minecraft is a really great example where you see that many users at many different ages are interested in playing games. And we could talk about what makes Minecraft so compelling, and how we could use that as an anchoring to engage students in game development or playing games for learning. And finally, we're going to talk about iteration. It's a principle in design itself. It's come into game design and in the technology world. And we really want to think about how we're developing games that can be updated through use. Right? Please write any questions in if you have ideas. But these are principles that really speak to what I've been trying to do over the last 20 years to make a case for how can you bring science into design education. And I want to mention that the course that I'm currently teaching has really developed into an R&D incubation model that is game inspired. We create our own ideas around being in a game world. I've curated it so I bring in colleagues, neuroscientists, UX designers, game company owners to give lectures and work with students. It's a 12-week class. Students are getting science credit hours, okay, and they are from different worlds of design. So the real challenge here was not to actually teach science to potential science majors, but to teach neuroscience as a subject that could be useful to designers in their future work in the field. And so the real challenge for me is to help them understand the field of neuroscience, the culture, the methods, the concepts, and the technologies. In other words, how do we take an ethnographic, how do we approach science as an ethnographic user base? Yeah, how do we approach it as a subject area and a field research area where students can actually enter in through participation observation? I'm trained as an ethnographer, and I believe that that research method, specifically qualitative research, is ideal for young designers who don't have any science background and in fact may even come in with an antipathy of science. So my goal is to game it up, to make it fun, so when they leave my class, they actually feel very confident in reading science abstracts. They feel confident in reaching out to neuroscientists, and they themselves begin to understand the impact neuroscience research has on taking care of their own brains. So my pedagogic logic operates like this. I have an epic challenge as well as the students have an epic challenge, to use Jane McGonigal's language, yeah, which is that the goal for the class, the goal for the students, is that they're going to develop better games so people can have better brains. And my idea of their winning is that they're going to develop their own brains so they can actually go into the game industry to develop better games. So in other words, it's a win-win on all sides of the target. Now there come with constraints when we approach this. We approach this class as project-based learning, you could say, and we're doing rapid prototyping. Now this is a real challenge for design students, particularly at Art Center, who are expected to achieve virtuosity and perfection. Rapid prototyping breaks down their defenses of having to make everything perfect. And it gets them ready to work in a tech-based culture, and it gets them ready to work in a team-based culture. The focus here, again, is on qualitative research into neuroscience, not quantitative. And so content in neuroscience for their games comes with constraints. One, we decided, particularly in the publication of David Rose's book, Enchanted Objects, we decided that a great way to think about adding data collection in their games was by including an enchanted object. So the constraint for this term and last term was that if they were going to develop a game for other people to use, right? So they're basically students learning how to design games for other people to use, that it should include an enchanted object in the narrative so they can collect data. And that the game had to be covered by 3 rules that come specifically from neuroscience: the science of rewards and failure, the science of end backing, and the science of emergent network growth. In other words, to learn about the connectome and to learn about neuroplasticity and apply that to game design. So here we have constraints brought in to address the transfer and the embedding of qualitative research that will be conducted by the students themselves. So let's focus then on the power of three. And right now, I would ask all of you to take a moment in this game world is to think about three particular methods that you use right now in your work. So take a moment to write them down. Just three methods that seem to arise in your own practice that are really that either you privilege or that you think really seem to have worked before I go on. So take a moment to write that down. And take a breath while you're doing that, right? So we all get to use all of our thinking today in an embodied way. And if one or two of you would like to, or any of you would like to share one of the pedagogic methods that you use to train people to make games, that would be great. So we could shove off. Looks like Joanne's typing in. Great. So the power of three is a chunking device that helps students remember what the pedagogic model is for the class. Networking, okay? Not in creating games, but in your role, so networking. Okay. So the power of three is a device for helping to remember information. It comes out of neuroscience to reduce the complexity of having to remember a lot. We focus on three big ideas, and the three big pedagogic ideas are that the students will be conducting qualitative research, and I will teach them how to do that. So the course involves teaching research methods, that they will be designing games for bodies moving in space. So this begins to focus on the game narrative and the game design. And we will include performative prototyping, which I will address, that depends on students using their own bodies as an iterative tool for advancing their rapid prototype experience. So in this idea of using qualitative research, I want to mention that in this class, I am brought into the game world with students so that we are on equal footing as knowledge seekers and as knowledge transfer experts. In other words, in our avatar role in this game world that we're creating in class, we both share the initiative and the challenge of knowledge transfer. Michael writes in, by the way, that he's using Habitica and RFG inspired to-do list. Great. Thanks, Michael. Thanks so much as a method. Great. And so I want to mention then, by looking at neuroscience as part of the game mechanics and qualitative research, the first thing I teach students is how to write a scientific précis once they've begun to do online literature review of neuroscience abstracts on all of the sites that are available online that come from science publication portals. So we're talking about Science Daily, Science News, the Brain Facts site from NSF and the Society of Neuroscience, PLOS, PubMed. In other words, students are looking literally at science writing by scientists. Their job is to understand that writing and put it in their own words with a point of view on how that will impact their development of design. So now neuroscience is positioned as a culture that has its own language, and it's a field that students can go begin to, as if you will, qualitative researchers, go look and see what people do. They also have the ability to look at neurotech writing, so that's not code per se, but literally press releases from neurotech companies, so they at least understand company representation as well. And I added here a comment that students wrote in evaluations on the impact of the science précis. And what I'm learning is that if I ask students to work as qualitative researchers and begin to write science in their own words, they recognize they now have an R&D tool. In other words, what they said is they stop feeling the need to rely on other researchers to do their work. They now can do their own science research, which is great as a time saver for, in some sense, for young designers, given the problems of collaboration. Right. So back to the powers of three. So in dealing with qualitative research, I'm actually focusing specifically then on précis writing and speaking to neuroscientists. I can talk later about the interviews, but they actually get to conduct interviews. They go find neuroscientists at universities or graduate students in neuroscience to begin to do 5-minute interviews to understand an area of research that impacts their own thinking around design. So the next area then in the Power of Three model is specifically to look at designing for bodies in space. And this came in when I learned working with students, if I would ask them to design game worlds, or a game mechanic, what I found is students were not thinking spatially. They might give me a game narrative, but the game world didn't exist in a space. And when they prototyped out and wireframe games, the games never had any environmental qualities. And we could speculate why this is in terms of a screen-based culture, but rather than speculation about that, I work directly using language of architecture and to begin to ask students to think about the actual space in which a game could be played online. And so I want to introduce how we're thinking about this through the work of Team Apollo, which is a team of 2 women who joined up to do qualitative research and in neuroscience. And I'm going to hold up on sharing that because I'd like for you to actually begin to understand their research from a game experience point of view. But let me just say this is neuroscience. It's not in physics. Yeah. So we're going to talk about Team Apollo's approach to developing a body in space environment, and they chose the world of the cosmos. And so this comes from questions that I asked students to imagine time-space parameters, whether the game that they were designing was the environment an Earth-based environment, a sky-based, an ocean-based. In other words, we did an entire think tank around creation myths. We talked about cities and suburbs, village forests and hinterlands. They had to learn the meaning of a hinterland, right? So not a term that students today think very much about. It's kind of an old-fashioned term. So they learned the idea of a hinterland. And we talked a lot about elements that would be in their games, whether this would be a culture that game environment that was metal-based or wood-based. Would there be gravity or not? And what was the time zone? Was it future? Was it past? Was it present? So we do an entire role play around space. And role playing is very important for students because some students, just to anchor you in some comparison, some students they didn't want to be in space, they wanted to be on the ground, and the fear group actually used a forest. So this image comes from the group that was researching fear. It looks like we have Nuria just walked in. So Nuria, just kind of jump in with us. We're actually working on this pedagogy of a 3-part method. And right now I'm speaking about the bodies in space method, which is how do you get students, if they're going to be developing games through their research in neuroscience, how they think specifically about the game environment. And we also address character definitions. Now, once again, I want to mention that this work that they're doing comes after qualitative research. In fact, this is a 12-week class, so they are conducting 6 weeks of science research only. I am performing lectures, and I have neuroscientists come in to develop, really share lectures and do projects specifically on learning actual science. We do mini experiments in understanding science, neuroscience principles. So the game design only comes in after qualitative research. And now their job as knowledge transfer experts is to actually design the game inspired and using their research to develop an understanding of the science in a metaphoric manner. So Team Apollo created Dodo. Dodo is a light hunter, and his epic challenge needs to light up stars, to light up neighboring planets, and to light up the whole universe. And the challenge includes avoiding him being sucked up into black holes, which are being created by a gravity king who wants to hog all the light. So this is the game narrative, environment, and the character design. Now, Team Apollo, I want you to know, won the prize for the best prototype. There were about 8 different groups in this term's class, and I had a group of reviewers come in, and they agreed that this game had enough meat that it could be taken to a next level of iteration and was actually worth playing as a game to learn about the science of light. So that is, in fact, the area that the Team Apollo chose as their area of research, which was the neuroscience of light. Dodo, as a character, comes in and he actually has to activate wayfinding. And wayfinding is a term from spatial science. And in fact, this team took the work out of our class on spatial memory, and they took the idea of place cells to address this idea of wayfinding and finding light through planets. And they also took up the challenge of understanding the connectome to understand emergent networks. So here they built the neuroscience right into their game narrative. Now, this is a key piece of the 3-part method. You can have students do qualitative research, and as visual designers, they've got lots of chops in developing games. And I should mention that this particular term, in light of the movement towards VR, all of the game environments were built in a very rudimentary form of VR design, which is Sketchfab. As the students begin to take other courses in Unity and Unreal Engine, they'll be coming in with different kinds of skill-based experience. But so we use Sketchfab as the baseline for how would you design games in 3D worlds. So it's all well and good to design visual games for these students, but our students need more than that. In fact, we found that if we bring in performative prototyping, which is a term that's used by a graduate design student in design media who comes out of dance as well, she uses performative prototyping as her term to talk about how do you move students from thinking about a word, in this case, let's try the word dog, and students might visualize a dachshund and they might pull an image of a dachshund off the internet, but we wanted them to get to a design of their own. So we've got to take them through a method of performing their game in real time, in real space, to bring in more channels of, if you will, of brain-mind processing, so they can come up with a different design that speaks directly to actual experience. So in the top image is an image from other students in the class who developed an animal game, and it was only through performative prototyping were they able to come up with this extended dachshund purple image where this animal grew through as a means of students touching it and it would reduce stress every time they actually touched or hugged the dachshund. That was their extended network. In the case of the Apollo group, the team Apollo below, the image on the left is the first iteration in 3D design. And what happened when they did a performative prototyping, they realized they had to space their network differently if people were literally going to wayfind through light. And it came through also through the practice of attempting to catch light one planet at a time. So this came from their moving through space one step at a time, imagining Dodo catching light one planet at a time. And they had to actually bring in end backing to increase their thinking around performative prototyping. So they were thinking about rewards. They were thinking about which would be rewards for catching light. But they want to understand how the network would grow. So there they're turning once again to the neuroscience of game mechanics, and they actually begin to develop a reward base that deals with end backing. So the reward base, first of all, is an enchanted object. It's a magic wand. I gave them the enchanted object. Their job was to figure out how to use it in the narrative. So and the enchanted object, once again, remember, it's supposed to collect data in the actual game mechanic, but in the narrative, it functions as a reward for the light hunter who's collecting a certain amount of light to light up the universe. And we do an entire suite of discussion on reward and failure and predictive analytics. And I suppose most of you know about dopamine. It's been in the popular press, and we take it quite seriously in our class to make sure that we don't just see it as the reward network, but we see it as the motivational network. And we look at the research of reward and failure, and we also understand it in terms of game strategy, which is not simply rewarding people for a simple move, but to understand that if you're going to reward a player in game world, it's got to be worth some effort. It's got to embrace a challenge. And there we actually speak directly, there we speak directly to this idea that reward-based systems in the brains and in games are really fundamentally pushed forward when the analytic predictions of reward will be matched up with the outcome. This is actually some very interesting research. I have a sources cited at the end that has come from the winners of the Brain Prize of game mechanics, particularly in their iterative analytical data collecting algorithm. And so within game design, students actually have to learn about algorithms. They actually have to learn about predictive analytics. And here we have a chance to think about how that would be built in through an enchanted object and through end backing. So back to the team Apollo, they learned about working memory. They understood that end backing is a method of moving a body through space or moving a game play through space in a manner that doesn't just simply move forward, but takes into account how memory can be created by the number of steps forward and the number of steps back. So without getting caught up too much on this, what I want to mention then is that the end backing method really helped to move the team Apollo to visualize their emergent network as a network of light, as a network of planets lighting up, and it would only move effectively through the end backing mechanism. So let me close this discussion, and we can open up to questions around this question of priming and the way it operated in class. So this is a principle that comes out of psychology. There's some very interesting neuroscience that backs up what happens in the prefrontal cortex when you actually bring in priming mechanisms. And what we mean by priming is how one stimulus, one idea can begin to catalyze memory of another. The Team Apollo was very smart. They started with studies in neuroscience on the perception of light. And as designers, they're taught about symbolic logic, and they are taught specifically about analog thinking. And they came up with the mythic god Apollo of light and reason to be the name for their game. So they actually integrated a priming mechanism in their game so that the title of their team would reinforce the research that inspired their game. So the take home then in this talk and this particular game workshop that I'm going to do in July speaks specifically to how do you actually teach science through helping kids develop brain games, not just playing games, but actually developing games. And if we approach science as an ethnographic culture, then we can approach science learning as a method of qualitative research, where students are rewarded for actually generating their own online research that then gets applied as a knowledge transfer practice to designing games for bodies moving in space. And that allows students to work not just visually, but performatively, which is that if they're going to rapid prototype, they do it as a multisensory experience, so that designing games isn't simply a screen-based opportunity, it's a performative opportunity to enhance screen-based learning. So with that, I want to thank everyone. You can find me on Twitter, you can find me on LinkedIn to have more discussions, but I think right now we want to open it up to questions, and I can speak to any aspect of this particular talk. Once again, I want to mention that we're going to be actually developing games as a workshop at the Serious Play Conference. So this is an introduction to the material that we're going to cover in the actual conference proceedings.